So a couple months ago, I made the first part of Serial Killers vs. Jack Reacher, but now looking back at it, I somehow left out a ton of the biggest fictional serial killers, and I don't know really what I was thinking at the time, and I guess I was trying to mix things up a little bit when I added Heart Eyes as one of the killers, but now with Reacher Season 4 on the way, and actually if you guys are watching this video, it would have came out today on Wednesday, but I'm obviously pre-recording this, so I figured there really isn't a better time to finally make a part 2, except this time we're putting some of the most notorious, dangerous, and skilled serial killers in fiction up against Jack Reacher to see whether he could actually track them down and come out on top. So the tiers are pretty self-explanatory. Coming in at the top, we have They Beat Reacher, then we have Honorable Battle, It'll Take Some Time, and Easy. So coming in first, we have Brian Moser. Now, you know when I add Dexter, you know I have to add his brother Brian too. Now, Brian's crime scenes are staged so carefully that Reacher would immediately realize this killer is trying to communicate with somebody. Instead of asking the typical question of what Brian is hiding, Reacher would start asking who Brian actually wants to notice all of this. He would also focus on the logistics of this case as well, because draining blood and leaving bodies around Miami requires a lot of time, transportation, and somewhere to work without being interrupted. Reacher would start mapping the crime scenes, looking at the distance between them, and narrowing down what areas Brian could realistically be operating from. But eventually, the biggest thing Reacher would notice is that Brian is not really communicating with Miami Metro as a whole. He is communicating with one specific person inside of it, and that would lead Reacher right to Dexter. Remember, because while all of this is happening, Reacher would already be investigating another unknown killer making criminals disappear around Miami, while another is leaving these extremely personal crime scenes that somehow keep getting reactions out of Dexter. Now, Reacher would not immediately know Brian and Dexter are brothers, but he would realize there has to be some kind of connection. He would start watching Dexter every time Brian leaves another clue. Maybe Dexter recognizes something too quickly, or understands a detail that means absolutely nothing to everybody else. And Reacher is exactly the kind of person who would notice that. So I mean, in the end, Brian would probably be the reason Reacher starts solving both cases at once, but everything Brian reveals also gives Reacher even more reason to start digging into Dexter. And for Brian, I would say it has to go in Honorable Battle, but I do inevitably think in the end, Reacher will win. Next, we have Dexter Morgan. Now, I actually think Dexter and Reacher would probably get along pretty well under completely different circumstances. Like, they both are basically vigilantes who go after people who deserve punishment, and if they somehow learned exactly what the other person was doing, I could honestly see them kind of having this weird mutual understanding. But for the sake of this video, let's just say they want to go after each other. Now, even before the Brian case, Reacher would probably get involved through one specific disappearance he was already chasing in Miami, then slowly discover that a lot of other missing people had something in common, that they were violent criminals, killers, or people that have somehow escaped punishment, and that would immediately tell Reacher these disappearances were not random. Somebody was selecting these people, and from there, Reacher would start asking the most important question: how does this person know who deserves to be targeted? That would eventually lead him toward law enforcement. Whoever is doing this would probably need access to criminal records, witness statements, or information that the general public does not have. That puts Miami Metro on Reacher's radar, and now Brian has already made Dexter look even more interesting. Reacher knows another serial killer was specifically communicating with Dexter for some odd reason, but the problem is that Dexter is extremely good at covering his tracks. Once he realizes Reacher is asking questions, Dexter would immediately become more careful. He might stop killing completely for a while, so instead of continuing to dig through old evidence, Reacher would start watching Dexter himself. He would pay attention to where Dexter goes after work and what suspects he keeps checking up on even after the police investigation has moved on. Eventually, Reacher would realize Dexter is not just investigating certain criminals, he is stalking them. That is where Dexter starts running out of options. He either stops killing completely while Reacher is watching him, or eventually he gives in and goes after another target. So eventually Dexter would lead Reacher straight to a kill room. And once Reacher walks in and sees Dexter standing there with a victim, there is really no explanation left. Now, Dexter could keep Reacher guessing for a long time because he is smarter and more careful than most of the people Reacher goes up against. But he cannot keep killing normally forever with Reacher focused on him, and once Reacher is on a case, he never lets go of it. I honestly think Jack Reacher might win. Next, we have Hannibal Lecter. Now, if Reacher was in Baltimore, Maryland chasing after the Chesapeake Ripper, he would eventually run into Hannibal Lecter, one of the main consultants on the case for the Chesapeake Ripper, and I feel like Reacher would probably become suspicious of Hannibal pretty pretty quickly, especially because Hannibal is almost too perfect. The way he speaks and even the way he reacts to horrific situations. Reacher is very good at recognizing when somebody is putting on a performance, and Hannibal would feel like one giant performance. But Hannibal would also realize very quickly that Reacher is watching him. He would understand that Reacher is not impressed by his intelligence or charm, and he would know that trying to fight Reacher directly would be a horrible idea. So Hannibal would never play Reacher's game. He would make Reacher play his. Instead of attacking him, Hannibal would start feeding him bad information. Maybe Reacher investigates one of Hannibal's victims and finds evidence pointing towards somebody else. And since Hannibal manipulates other serial killers to do his bidding, I don't think that would be too far stretched. Reacher could spend days following that lead before realizing that everything was arranged to move him away from Hannibal. Even if Reacher breaks into Hannibal's house, Hannibal would probably already expect it. If he knows Reacher suspects him, he would clean everything and prepare his house for a possible invasion. Hannibal could also use the police against Reacher. If Reacher keeps accusing a respected psychiatrist of being a cannibal without having any evidence, eventually he starts looking like the unstable one. Even though Reacher is very skilled in hand-to-hand, Hannibal sending multiple serial killers his way will inevitably weaken Reacher, to which Hannibal could just then finish the job himself. So eventually, 100% Hannibal does beat Jack Reacher. Next we have John Kramer. John Kramer would be a much different challenge because Reacher would probably understand fairly quickly that the traps themselves are the biggest clues. Jigsaw's games are extremely complicated, and somebody needs all of these tools to put these huge traps together and enough time to build everything without getting caught. Reacher would focus heavily on that side of the investigation. Instead of spending all his time trying to understand Jigsaw's philosophy, he would start asking the practical questions, and that trail could eventually point him towards John Kramer, especially once Reacher starts looking into engineering backgrounds and people connected to the buildings where the games happen. Now John would probably realize Reacher was getting close and decide to put him in a game. But the thing is, putting Reacher in a game is a pretty hard task in of itself. First of all, you would need to outsmart him, and then you would need to lug his huge body into one of these traps. But I feel like with the resources that John Kramer possesses and all of his apprentices, I feel like he could probably get Jack Reacher in one of these games. But then again, putting Jack Reacher in one of his games could actually be his biggest mistake, or probably a win, because Reacher would be extremely difficult to control inside a jigsaw trap because he does not panic easily. His first reaction would probably be studying the room instead of immediately obeying whatever the tape is playing. Reacher would basically try to break the game instead of playing it, but the thing is, John Kramer's games are designed to punish cheaters. One wrong move and the next thing you know, you're disabled for the rest of your life. But the bigger problem would be John's apprentices. Even if Reacher identifies Kramer and kills him, somebody like Hoffman could still be working inside law enforcement and leaking information. Once Hoffman or another apprentice is exposed, the whole operation starts getting much easier to trace. Now eventually I do think Reacher kills Kramer, but even after killing Kramer, the games still don't end. This one I would also have to put it in honorable battle. Next we have Patrick Bateman. Trying to find out if Patrick Bateman is a serial killer or not is pretty simple. Like all Reacher would have to do is go to New York City, wait until it hits nighttime, and simply just walk around until you see someone in a suit stabbing a homeless man to death in public. Or until you see some psychopath on the news running around his apartment with his cheeks out with a chainsaw cocked back at maximum capacity. To prove Patrick is a killer is pretty easy, but catching him might be a little harder if you haven't witnessed his acts in person, because everybody around Patrick is obsessed with money, clothes, restaurants, and status. People constantly confuse each other, and that actually could protect Patrick Bateman for just a little bit, because the funny thing is, if Reacher ever came up to one of Patrick's friends and asked him information about Patrick, they wouldn't even know who Patrick Bateman is, because sometimes they call him a completely different name, and sometimes even mistake him for a different person. But eventually, it wouldn't be too hard for Reacher to find out where Patrick Bateman lives. And once he knocks on the door and Patrick opens it, the first thing that Patrick would get greeted by is a bullet to the head. So with this, just because of all of the annoying confusion that might go on around this whole entire case, I would just say it'll take some time, but realistically, it is easy to kill Patrick Bateman. Next, we have Norman Bates. Now, Reacher would arrive at the Bates Motel looking for somebody who disappeared recently, and when he arrives at the front desk, he would run into none other than Norman Bates. Reacher would ask some questions like, do you know of this person named Marion Crane? Norman would say she already checked out. Reacher would then ask for a room and would scout the area only to realize her car is still there. And that alone would tell him that somebody here is the killer, and from there, Norman would have a hard time keeping his story story straight. Reacher asks very simple questions, and simple questions are difficult to lie around. Eventually, Norman would contradict himself. Once he gets inside the house and discovers what is actually happening, Norman has nowhere left to go. He could attack Reacher dressed as his mother and maybe even surprise him for a second, but Norman is not overpowering him, and that right there would be the end of the story. So for Norman, I feel like it would be pretty easy. Next, we have Michael Myers. Now again, Michael is probably one of the easiest killers here to identify, just like Patrick Bateman, except he's one of the hardest to actually stop permanently. If Reacher arrives in Haddonfield during one of Michael's killing sprees, there would be no huge mystery about who is doing it. So Reacher's real job would be figuring out where Michael is going next, and he would notice pretty quickly that Michael does not just wander around completely randomly. He stalks people and tends to focus on specific targets such as family members. Reacher would read his file and know that Michael killed his family when he was just a boy. So Reacher would conclude that Michael's next target would have to be another relative, such as Laurie Strode, who lives in Haddonfield. Reacher would use that against him, because instead of running around town chasing Michael, Reacher would just stake out near Laurie's house and wait until he has arrived. And that alone already makes Reacher better prepared than most people Michael faces. And if Reacher shoots him and Michael gets back up, he is not going to freeze in disbelief. He's going to immediately understand that normal force is not enough, and he's going to have to change his tactics. But the problem with Michael is that Reacher has no real way to permanently kill him. And Reacher doesn't necessarily capture his victims to put them behind bars. He usually shoots to kill. Now, Reacher would probably win if he had a gun, but eventually, if Michael Myers ever lays a hand on Jack Reacher, his superhuman strength is nowhere near a normal person like Reacher. Well, Reacher isn't a normal person in strength. He's definitely in the top tier of human in terms of strength, but against a superhuman, he doesn't really stand any chance. So eventually, yes, Michael will kill Reacher. And last but not least, we have Joe Goldberg. Joe leaves an unbelievable amount of suspicious stuff behind him. Joe appears helpful at first, as he always does, because, I'll give it to him. He's smart and he comes up with good cover-ups on his feet. But Reacher would probably notice something is a little sketchy with this guy. Now, as we all know, Joe has a bad habit of being way too involved in other people's lives. He knows where they go and what they are doing at times when he realistically should not know any of that. That would immediately get Reacher's attention. Then Joe would probably make things worse by stalking Reacher himself, so he knows who he's going up against. Now, Joe normally thinks he is invisible when he follows people, but Reacher would notice him almost immediately with his military background. Instead of confronting Joe, Reacher would probably let him keep following. Joe might think he's learning Reacher's routine, while Reacher is actually watching how Joe operates. And once he started digging into Joe Goldberg's past, he would notice that old girlfriends disappear, people around him die, etc., etc. And eventually, Reacher would start researching places that are connected to him, and he would find something like the cage. At that point, the investigation would be over, and Joe's only real option would be trying to kill Reacher before Reacher kills him. Essentially, Reacher is the problem Joe usually avoids. His victims normally do not understand what he is capable of until it is too late, and Reacher, on the other hand, would. So I would say Joe Goldberg goes into it'll take some time, and I would put him over Patrick Bateman.